Hi, welcome to my channel. I have a new story for you today.
My name is Valerie Russell, and I am 31 years old. Exactly 24 hours before my wedding. My phone rang. I was standing in my bookbindery in Missouri, surrounded by the heavy scent of raw leather and archival glue. My hands were covered in binding paste. I was carefully restitching the spine of a 1920s hymnal, a job that requires absolute precision. When the screen lit up on my workbench, the caller ID said, "Dad." I wiped my hands on my canvas apron and hit the speaker button. He did not say hello. He did not ask how the preparations were going or if I was excited. He cleared his throat, using the exact same detached corporate monotone he always used when denying a client claim at his insurance firm. "Valerie, I am not going to walk you down the aisle tomorrow." I stopped working. I held a piece of carved horn, called a bone folder, hovering over the open book. I stared at the speaker. "Why?" "Dad, your sister says it would be too emotionally taxing for her to watch me give you away. She is going through a rough patch, and we need to be sensitive to her feelings right now." I did not scream. I did not cry or beg him to reconsider. Instead, I focused entirely on my hands. I set the bone folder down on the solid oak workbench. I moved slowly, deliberately, because I knew if I squeezed my fingers even a fraction tighter, I would snap the tool straight in half. My own father was abandoning his role at my wedding because my older sister Alyssa was having a bad month. Alyssa is 34, a high-powered public relations executive in St. Louis and the undisputed center of my parents' universe. She is currently dealing with a pending divorce. Her picture-perfect marriage was falling apart, and instead of handling it like an adult, she decided my wedding was a threat to her need for control. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. My mother, Helen. She always handled the cleanup. "Your father told you," she said. It was not a question. "Do not make a scene about this. Valerie, go solo. Stop making drama. Lots of modern brides walk alone." She pitched her voice up, making it sound bright and artificial, as if she were pitching me a new lifestyle trend. It is actually quite empowering if you think about it. I hung up without saying a word. They expected me to walk alone. They expected me to absorb the humiliation silently, the way I had absorbed every other insult for 3 decades. But 24 hours later, when the doors of the venue swung open, I was not alone. The man holding my arm was not my father by blood, but he was 10 times the man my father could ever be. And when my parents saw him, the look of shock on their faces was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Before I tell you who walked me down that aisle and how my sister's ultimate power play backfired in front of everyone, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you have ever had to build your own family from scratch. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. But to understand why that moment at the altar was so devastating for my parents, I need to take you back and show you exactly how the Russell family operates. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to understand the space Alyssa occupies. My sister is a public relations executive in St. Louis. She handles crisis management for corporate brands. She is married to a commercial real estate developer. They live in a sprawling, meticulously landscaped house in Liu. I spend my days working with bone folders, awls, and linen thread. I fix broken spines and torn pages in a shop that smells perpetually of dust and aging paper. The family hierarchy was established long before I ever signed a commercial lease. My parents operate on a simple economic principle. Alyssa is the blue-chip investment. I am the write-off. The contrast is clearest in the numbers. When Alyssa got married 5 years ago, my parents paid $80. $000 for a country club reception. I know the exact figure because my mother deliberately left the catering invoice on the kitchen island for 3 weeks. The event was a spectacle. There were hand-carved ice sculptures. There were imported orchids flown in from Hawaii. Alyssa wore a custom silk gown that required 5 separate fittings. My father wore a tailored tuxedo and gave a 2-0 toast about how his oldest daughter was the light of his life. I was forced to stand in the background wearing a peach chiffon bridesmaid dress I had to purchase myself despite barely making rent at the time. My own wedding cost exactly $15. Ling ling ling. I paid for every single cent of it out of pocket. I spent 4 years working 6 0-hour weeks at the binder to build that savings account. I took grueling commissions, restoring ruined water, damaged family Bibles. I breathed in mold and flaking leather. I rubbed salve into the calluses on my fingers every night. My fiancé Caleb works as a paramedic for the county. He picked up back-to-back double shifts, riding in the back of an ambulance on 3 hours of sleep so we could afford a local catering company. I did not ask my parents for a dime. I knew a financial contribution from them would come with a leash. And I wanted my marriage to start on free ground. My refusal to ask for their money offended them, but it did not surprise me. I learned to stop expecting my parents to show up a long time ago. The defining lesson happened on a Tuesday in May. 7 years earlier, it was my college graduation. I had earned a dual degree in history and preservation. Graduating with high honors, the ceremony was held outdoors on the university green. It was a sweltering afternoon. I sat in my black polyester robe on a metal folding chair, sweating beneath the heavy fabric, waiting for the letter R to be called. When I finally walked across the wooden stage, the dean handed me my diploma holder and shook my hand. I turned to look at Section 4. Row G. That was the specific block where my parents had reserved seats months in advance. The row was entirely empty. I stood on the stage and stared at 3 plastic chairs baking in the sun. There was no applause from my family. There was no camera flashing. I walked down the steps, returned to my seat, and sat in silence for the next 2 hours. They were 200 miles away in St. Louis. Alyssa was pregnant with her first child at the time. She had called our mother in a panic that morning because she could not decide between 2 shades of yellow paint for the nursery walls. She claimed the stress was causing false contractions. My parents abandoned my college graduation to look at paint swatches. When I called my mother that evening, I was standing alone in my studio, apartment. I could hear my classmates cheering and celebrating at a crowded restaurant across the street. My mother answered the phone sounding exhausted but not apologetic. She told me the nursery was a time-sensitive priority. She said I had my degree, and the ceremony was just a formality anyway. Then she delivered the line that became the thesis of our relationship. You are smart enough to understand that your sister needs support right now. Valerie. Stop keeping score. I hung up the phone, placed my diploma in a desk drawer, and went to work a closing shift at a local bookstore. That is the architecture of my family. Alyssa pulls a lever, and my parents rush to grease the gears. And right now, the gears in Alyssa's life are grinding to a brutal halt. Her perfect marriage to the wealthy developer is a crumbling facade. 6 months ago, she discovered her husband was having an affair with his paralegal. He filed for divorce shortly after. He is keeping the house in lieu. Alyssa is losing her status. Financial safety net. And the flawless image she spent a decade carefully cultivating. She moved back into my parents' house for 3 weeks. They transformed their entire daily routine to cater to her grief. They spoke in hushed tones. They brought her meals on trays. But instead of dealing with the wreckage of her own choices, Alyssa aimed her crosshairs directly at me. My upcoming wedding became a mirror, reflecting everything she was losing. Seeing me build something real with a man who actually respects me was intolerable to her. The sabotage started small. She criticized the restored stone mill I booked for the venue, calling it rustic and cheap. She complained that my hand-tied wildflower bouquets looked like weeds. When those comments failed to get a reaction out of me, she escalated. She realized she could not control her husband. She could not control her impending divorce. But she could control my wedding day. She knew exactly which buttons to press. She sat at my parents' kitchen table and cried, telling my father that watching him walk me down the aisle would trigger a severe emotional breakdown. She claimed it would remind her of the day he walked her down the aisle, and the pain would simply be too much to bear. She weaponized her own misery, twisting it into a tool to dismantle my joy. And my father, a man who has never once chosen the hard right over the easy wrong, folded immediately. He did not defend me. He did not tell his 4-year-old daughter to seek therapy or handle her emotions like an adult. He traded my milestone to buy a few hours of peace from his golden child. He chose to break my heart rather than endure Alyssa's complaints. They thought I would simply accept the demotion. They thought I would walk down that aisle alone, keeping the peace, playing my assigned role as the background character in Alyssa's tragedy. They were wrong. My parents assumed I would simply absorb the blow. They thought I would walk down the aisle of that stone mill alone, keeping my chin up so my sister could maintain her fragile grip on the spotlight. They expected me to play my assigned part in the background of her tragedy. But they misunderstood the kind of life I have spent the last decade constructing. When you dedicate your days to restoring ruined things, you learn very quickly how to identify a strong foundation. You learn what materials will hold under pressure and what materials will snap, and my foundation did not share my last name. His name is Thomas. He is 68 years old. He spent 4 decades teaching high school history before retiring. And he is the former owner of the brick building where I lease my commercial space. Thomas is not a man of grand declarations or theatrical displays of affection. He drinks black coffee from a dented steel thermos. He has severe arthritis in his left hand from years of grading papers and woodworking. He does not offer empty praise or unsolicited advice. Instead of talking, he offers unyielding physical presence. The stark difference between biological obligation and chosen loyalty became clear to me when I was 24 years old. I had just signed the lease for the binder. I possessed a small business loan, a terrifying amount of ambition, and absolutely no safety net. The storefront was an empty, echoing rectangle with exposed brick walls and a cold concrete floor. I invited my father to see the space, hoping for a shred of validation. David arrived on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He stood in the center of the dusty room, refusing to touch anything so he would not ruin his sleeves. He looked at the peeling paint, checked his expensive watch inside. He asked if I was truly prepared to take on so much financial debt for a cute hobby. He stayed for exactly 12 minutes. He did not offer to help me sweep. He did not ask to see my business plan. He simply cataloged my risk, labeled it insignificant, and walked out the door to return to his sterile corporate office. I was standing alone in the center of the empty shop, fighting a wave of crushing defeat when Thomas walked through the front door. He lived in the apartment above the storefront at the time. He had watched my father leave. Thomas did not ask me if I was okay. He did not offer me a pitying smile. He walked in holding a worn leather tool belt and a yellow tape measure. He looked at the blank brick wall, pulled the tape measure out, and asked me where I wanted the primary shelving. For the next 3 weekends, Thomas showed up every Saturday morning at 7:00. We hauled heavy oak boards up the front steps. The air filled with the sharp smell of cut wood and sawdust. Thomas worked beside me in steady silence, teaching me how to find the studs in a century-old wall and how to anchor the brackets so they would never pull loose. When we finally finished the installation, my hands were blistered and my muscles ached. But the shop had bones. Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead, packed up his tools, and told me the shelves would hold us 0 pounds of books without bowing. He was right. Over the next 8 years, that pattern of quiet reliability never wavered. Thomas attended every single one of my shop anniversaries. He never expected an invitation or a formal announcement. He simply knew the date. He would walk through the door at 9:00 inches the morning, buy a single cup of coffee from the cafe next door, sit on the wooden stool by the window, and watch me work for an hour. When the freezing Missouri winters hit, my father would send a generic text message telling me to stay warm. Thomas would show up unannounced with a ladder to check the weather stripping on my drafty windows and change the industrial HVAC filters. Thomas pays full price for every antique book he brings me to restore, insisting that hard labor deserves fair compensation. He respects my time and my craft, recognizing it as a legitimate career rather than a secondary distraction. Because of this history, when I met the man I was going to marry, I did not bring him to the sprawling house in Liu for his first introduction. I brought him to the binder. Caleb is a paramedic for the county. He works grueling double shifts riding in the back of an ambulance on 3 hours of sleep, pulling broken people out of wrecked cars. He does not care about country club memberships or social posturing. He understands the fragile, gritty reality of being human. I knew instinctively that Caleb and my biological family would speak 2 entirely different languages, but I also knew Caleb would understand Thomas. I introduced them on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was at the shop tightening a loose brass hinge on my front door. Caleb walked in, wearing his dark blue uniform fresh off a 1-2-hour shift. I watched the 2 men evaluate each other. There was no posturing. There was no interrogating Caleb about his salary or his 5-year financial plan. Thomas wiped the grease off his hands with a cloth rag. He stepped forward and extended his right hand. Caleb met his grip firmly. Thomas looked at the thick calluses on Caleb's palms. A byproduct of lifting stretchers and saving lives, Thomas held the handshake for an extra beat. Looking Caleb directly in the eye. "She builds things that last," Thomas said quietly. "Make sure you do." "Too." Caleb nodded, his expression dead serious. "I intend to." Sir. Standing in my shop now 24 hours before my wedding, with the dial tone still humming in my ear after my mother's cold phone call, I let my hand trace the edge of the oak workbench. I looked at the shelves spanning the length of the room. I thought about the man who helped me build them. I realized in that quiet moment that fatherhood is not an automatic right, granted by a shared genetic code. It is a title earned through labor, through consistency, and through the willingness to show up when the heavy lifting is required. David gave me a last name. Thomas gave me a place to stand. A profound sense of calm settled over my shoulders. The panic my parents intended to inflict simply dissolved, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I knew exactly who was going to walk me down that aisle tomorrow, but tomorrow was still a day away. Tonight, I had to survive the rehearsal dinner. The event was scheduled to begin in 3 hours at a small, warmly lit Italian restaurant downtown. Caleb and I had booked the private back room months in advance, paying the deposit from our own savings. My biological family was expected to attend. They expected me to walk into that restaurant with my head bowed, silently accepting my demotion, grateful that they even bothered to grace my event with their presence. They assumed the conflict was over. They assumed I would follow the script Helen had written for me. They had no idea that the script was already burning. As I untied my canvas work apron and locked the front door of the binder, I braced myself for the evening. I knew my mother never left a power dynamic unchallenged. And I knew Alyssa would never allow a room full of people to focus their attention on someone else for an entire evening. The sabotage was coming, and the battleground was set. The Italian restaurant was located 3 blocks from my binder. Caleb and I chose it because it was honest. There were no white glove, servers, or crystal chandeliers. There were exposed brick walls, scarred wooden tables, and the rich, heavy scent of roasted garlic and wood smoke. We had paid the deposit ourselves, reserving the private back room for 30 people. Caleb arrived straight from the firehouse. Snorts. He smelled faintly of rain and antiseptic. A lingering trace of a 1-2 hour shift. He wore a dark navy button-down shirt and stood near the doorway greeting his family. His relatives filled the room with genuine warmth. They laughed loudly. They pulled chairs together. They shared stories over baskets of warm bread. Caleb has a large, grounded family from a farming community just outside the city. His mother, Brenda, runs a 300-acre soybean farm. She has calloused hands and a laugh that carries across a crowded room. She hugged me the moment she walked in, telling me I looked beautiful. I smiled and thanked her. But my eyes kept drifting toward the door. The reservation began at 6:00. Besześć 30. 3 chairs at the head table remained empty. My parents and my sister arrived, 40 minutes late. They did not enter apologizing for the delay. They did not quietly slip into their seats. They walked into the private room like they were inspecting a property they had no intention of buying. Alyssa led the way. She wore a high-necked, long-sleeved dress. It was entirely black. It was the exact type of garment you would purchase for a formal winter funeral. She paired it with dark sunglasses, pushed back on top of her head, even though the sun had set an hour ago. She walked past Caleb's extended family without offering a single nod of acknowledgement. My mother followed closely behind her, carrying Alyssa's designer coat like an assistant. My father brought up the rear. David did not look at me. He did not look at Caleb. He was staring down at his phone screen, typing an email with his thumbs, letting his wife and oldest daughter dictate the temperature of the room. They sat down at the table. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The easy laughter from Caleb's relatives dialed back into cautious murmurs. Alyssa picked up the wine menu resting in the center of the table. She held it by the very edge of the cardstock, scanning the list with a tight frown. When a young waiter approached to pour water, she did not look up at his face. She tapped her fingernail against the paper. "What is your reserve list?" she asked. The waiter smiled politely. "We have a house red and a house white for the private parties." "Mom." Both are local Missouri blends. Alyssa dropped the menu onto the table. It made a sharp slapping sound. She let out a long theatrical sigh loud enough for half the room to hear. "A local blend," she repeated. "Fine. Just bring me a glass of whatever will give me the smallest headache. I am already dealing with enough right now." The waiter blinked, nodded, and walked away. Caleb reached under the table and placed his hand over my knee. His grip was steady and grounding. He leaned in and whispered that we only had to survive 2 more hours. I squeezed his hand back. I refused to let Alyssa ruin my appetite. I focused on the food. I focused on the conversation with Brenda, who was telling a story about a tractor repair gone wrong. But my mother was not going to let the evening pass without extracting a toll. Helen sat 2 seats away from me. She barely touched her pasta. She spent the meal observing Alyssa watching her oldest daughter sip the house wine with an expression of profound misery. Helen was calculating. She was looking for a way to center Alyssa in a room that was fundamentally gathered to celebrate me. When the plates were being cleared, Helen caught my eye. She tilted her head toward the back hallway that led to the restrooms. It was a silent command. I placed my napkin on the table, excused myself, and walked toward the corridor. The hallway was narrow, smelling faintly of industrial floor cleaner mixed with my mother's expensive floral perfume. Helen was waiting near the exit door, her arms crossed over her chest. The ambient noise of the restaurant clattered behind us. But back here, the silence felt thick and dangerous. She did not waste time with small talk. Valerie? We need to discuss the reception schedule for tomorrow, she said. Her tone was brisk and managerial. I leaned my shoulder against the brick wall. Caleb and the coordinator have the timeline. Mom, the toasts are right after dinner. Yes, the toast, she said, stepping a fraction closer. I want you to make an addition to your speech. When you have the microphone, I need you to take a moment to acknowledge your sister. I stared at her. Acknowledge my sister. Helen nodded, her expression dead serious. You need to mention the difficult season she is currently navigating. You need to thank her publicly for having the strength to stand beside you despite her own heartbreaking. It will show solidarity. I felt my heart rate slow down. The sheer audacity of the request was staggering. My sister was wearing a funeral dress to my rehearsal dinner. She had already successfully bullied my father into abandoning his role in the plea ceremony. Now, my mother was demanding I use my own wedding speech to generate pity for Alyssa's pending divorce. I looked at the woman who raised me. I saw the relentless, exhausting machinery of her favoritism working in real time. Mom, I said quietly, my wedding is not a therapy session for my sister. Helen stiffened. Her eyes narrowed. You are being incredibly selfish. Valerie, your sister is losing everything. Her husband left her. Her home is being divided. The least you can do is carve out 2 minutes of your day to make her feel valued. It is the only way she will feel comfortable staying for the cake cutting. Then she can leave before the cake is cut. The words left my mouth without hesitation. They were calm, flat, and final. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms. I simply delivered a boundary that could not be negotiated. Helen inhaled sharply. The mask of the concerned matriarch slipped, revealing the cold enforcer underneath. She looked at me, not as a daughter on the eve of her wedding, but as a subordinate who had justified a direct order. You have always been so hard. Valerie, she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You lack any trace of empathy. We are trying to keep this family from fracturing, and you are fighting us every step of the way. I am not fighting you, I replied. I am getting married. If Alyssa cannot handle watching someone else be happy for 4 hours, she should stay at your house tomorrow. Helen took a step back. She smoothed the front of her tailored blouse, regaining her icy composure. She looked me up and down, evaluating the damage, calculating her next move. The restaurant chatter seemed to fade out completely. Fine, Helen said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm now. Do it your way. But hear me clearly. If you cannot be generous to your sister, do not expect us to be generous to you tomorrow. She turned on her heel and walked back into the private dining room. She did not look back. I stood alone in the hallway for a long moment. I listened to the sound of her heels clicking against the tile floor. I felt the weight of her words settling over me. It was not a warning. It was a promise. She was telling me that my biological family was going to withdraw their support entirely. They were going to punish me for refusing to put Alyssa first. I took a deep breath of the garlic-scented air. I pressed my hands flat against the cool brick wall to steady myself. I was not afraid. The anxiety that usually accompanied my mother's threats was gone. I walked back, into the dining room. I sat down next to Caleb. I looked at the three miserable people sitting at the end of the table, trapped in their own bitter ecosystem. The line had been drawn. The rehearsal dinner concluded 30 minutes later. My parents and Alyssa left the restaurant before the dessert plates were even cleared. David paid the valet without saying a word to me. I went home that night, knowing exactly what was coming. I knew tomorrow was going to be a battle, but as I set my alarm for 5 inches the morning, I felt a strange sense of peace. The tension was thick, suffocating, and perfectly set the stage for the wedding day, because tomorrow they were going to play their final card. And they were going to find out that I was no longer playing their game. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy stillness. I woke up at exactly 5:00. Well before the alarm was set to ring, I lay in the center of my bed and listened to the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, outside my window. The Missouri air was sharp and cool. A thick layer of fog was rolling off the nearby river, settling over the damp asphalt of the street below. It was the kind of morning that felt suspended in time. I pushed the covers aside and placed my bare feet on the hardwood floor. The wood was cold, and the sensation grounded me. I walked into the kitchen and started a pot of coffee. The dark, bitter scent began to fill the small apartment. Pushing back the lingering smell of rain from the night before, I walked over to the kitchen counter and looked at my phone. The screen was completely dark. I tapped the glass to wake it up. There were no missed calls. There were no frantic text messages from my father apologizing for the night before. There was no message from my mother attempting to smooth over the threat she had delivered in the restaurant hallway. The silence was absolute. It was a weapon they were actively choosing to wield. They were waiting for me to crack. They expected me to wake up in a state of sheer panic, realize the gravity of their withdrawal, and call them begging for a truce. They wanted me to offer Alyssa the public apology she felt entitled to. Instead of breaking down, I felt a cold, clear wave of certainty wash over me. The anxiety that had plagued me for weeks simply evaporated. I poured a mug of black coffee, carried it to the small table by the window. I watched the fog shift against the streetlights. I did not shed a single tear. Crying would imply that I was surprised by their cruelty. And I was no longer surprised. I was just finally done pretending they might change. I watched the digital clock on my microwave shift to 6:30. I set my mug down, picked up my phone, scrolled past the contact list containing my biological family, and dialed a different number. It rang twice. Thomas answered on the third ring. His voice was growly from sleep, but he did not sound annoyed. I did not apologize for waking him up at dawn on a Saturday. I did not launch into a long, tearful explanation of the rehearsal dinner. I spoke 3 sentences. My dad backed out. I said, I am not walking alone. I need you. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Thomas did not ask me what happened. He did not offer useless platitudes or tell me that things would eventually work out. He did not sigh or make me feel like a burden. His response was a masterclass in stoic love. I will wear the navy suit, he said. What time do you need me there? I closed my eyes. The uncomplicated weight of his support anchored me to the floor. 1:00, I told him. He told me he would be there at noon. And then he hung up the phone. The interaction took less than 40 seconds. That brief staccato exchange stood in stark contrast to the exhausting, the manipulative conversations I had endured with my parents for 31 years. With Thomas, there was no emotional toll to pay. There was no hidden agenda. There was just a man stepping into the breach. Because a breach existed, I took a shower and let the hot water wash away the last traces of the rehearsal dinner. When I stepped out, I dried off and began the physical work of getting ready. I did not hire a sprawling team of hair and makeup artists. I wanted my morning to remain quiet and focused. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and applied my own makeup. Keeping my hands steady, I looked at my reflection. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a woman with a plan. I walked into my bedroom and unzipped the garment bag holding my wedding dress. The fabric was crisp and heavy. As I pulled it off the hanger, my fingers brushed against the delicate silk. I paused and looked down at my hands. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a woman who spent her life avoiding hard work. They were a map of my survival. There were thick calluses on the pads of my fingers from pulling linen thread tight across leather spines. There was a faint white scar across my left thumb from a slip of a bookbinding knife 3 years ago. There were permanent traces of archival glue trapped in the creases of my knuckles. These hands had built a business from concrete walls. They had paid for the paid on a dress I was currently holding. They had secured the venue, signed the contracts, and forged a life that did not depend on my parents' conditional approval. I stepped into the dress and pulled the zipper up. The bodice fit perfectly, wrapping around my ribs like a protective shell. I walked over to my dresser, where my bridal bouquet was waiting in a glass vase. It was a tight arrangement of white ranunculus, dark thistles, and wild greenery. I opened my top drawer and pulled out a small piece of vintage lace. It was a remnant from a deteriorated 19th century journal I had restored the previous winter. The client had allowed me to keep the scrap. It was stained and frayed at the edges. A piece of history that had survived fire and neglect. I took a small pearl-headed pin and secured the lace to the stems of the bouquet. I am a woman who fixes broken things for a living. I take torn pages, cracked leather, and ruined spines, and I stitch them back together until they can hold their own weight again. Today, I was applying that exact same trade to my own life. I was taking the ruined, fractured pieces of my family dynamic and stitching a new narrative right over the top of it. My father thought his absence would break the spine of my wedding day. He thought removing his presence would cause the entire event to collapse inward. He was about to find out that my structural integrity had nothing to do with him. I checked my phone one last time before putting it into a small clutch purse. Still nothing. The silence from Liu remained, unbroken. I imagined my mother sitting in her pristine kitchen sipping her coffee, confident that her psychological warfare was working. I imagined Alyssa sleeping late, resting up for another day of playing the tragic heroine. They were assuming I was currently in tears, scrambling to figure out how to navigate the ceremony without them. They believed their approval was the currency I needed to proceed. I picked up my keys and walked out the front door of my apartment. I locked the deadbolt behind me, feeling the solid click of the mechanism. The morning fog was beginning to lift, burned away by the early Missouri sun. The air was warming up, promising a bright, clear October afternoon. I got into my car and started the engine. The drive to the venue would take 30 minutes. I drove with the radio off, listening only to the steady rhythm of the tires against the highway. I did not feel fear. I felt the dangerous, quiet energy of a trap about to be sprung. The stone mill sat on a sprawling piece of property bordered by old growth, oak trees. As I turned onto the gravel driveway, the silhouette of the building came into view. It was a fortress of limestone and heavy timber, built to withstand a century of floods and harsh winters. It was exactly where I belonged today. I parked my car near the side entrance reserved for the bridal party. I grabbed my garment bag and my bouquet, walking toward the heavy wooden doors. The venue coordinator met me in the lobby. She asked if I needed anything, her eyes scanning my face for any signs of pre-wedding panic. I told her I only needed a glass of water and the key to the upstairs suite. I walked up the narrow wooden staircase to the second floor, the floorboards groaning under my feet. When I reached the top landing, I looked out the large arched window that overlooked the main guest parking lot. The empty gravel spaces were waiting to be filled. Soon Caleb's family would arrive loud and joyful. And soon after that, my biological family would arrive. They would walk into this mill, expecting a surrender. They would sit in their chairs, confident in the leverage they held over me. They had no idea that I had already changed the locks on the doors they thought they controlled. And the real confrontation was just hours away. The venue was a restored 19th century stone mill, situated on the edge of a deep Missouri creek. It was an imposing structure built from limestone blocks, hand-hunned by men who understood permanence. The original iron water, he still sat locked in place against the exterior wall. A monument to industrial endurance. Inside, the air smelled of aged Cedar River water and the faint, sweet scent of crushed autumn leaves. It was an environment that demanded respect. I had booked it because it possessed the exact same resilient bones I looked for in a centuries-old manuscript. It was a place designed to weather storms and grind wheat into flour through sheer unyielding pressure. Today, it was going to serve as the anvil for my own life. I stood in the bridal suite on the second floor. The room featured wide plank pine floors and a massive arched window that overlooked the front gravel courtyard and the outdoor ceremony space. I stood a few feet back from the glass, hidden by the shadows of the room, watching the logistics of my wedding unfold below. The string quartet was tuning their instruments near the altar. The caterers were carrying trays of glassware across the patio. And the guests were beginning to arrive. The first vehicles to turn down the long driveway were a procession of pickup trucks and sturdy domestic SUVs. Caleb's family traveled like a pack. Doors opened and shut with heavy metallic thuds. Laughter immediately drifted up to my second-story window. I watched Brenda step out of a truck wearing a deep emerald dress that complemented her practical nature. She immediately began directing traffic, pointing her sons toward the gift table, adjusting her husband's tie, and hugging relatives she had not seen since the last holiday. They moved as a single, cohesive unit. There was no hesitation in their steps. They were loud, warm, and entirely present. Watching them claim the front rows on the groom's side of the aisle, I felt a deep, validating warmth in my chest. I was marrying into a structure that actually held weight. 10 minutes later, a pristine silver luxury sedan crunched onto the gravel. I recognized the license plate immediately. My stomach tightened, a residual reflex from decades of conditioning. But I forced my breathing to remain slow and even. David put the car in park. Helen opened her own door before he could even turn off the engine. Alyssa emerged from the back seat. Alyssa had traded her funeral black from the rehearsal dinner for a dark, muted slate gray dress that still projected an aura of mourning. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over her face. They stood by the car for a moment. An isolated island of tension in the middle of a joyous gathering. They did not speak to each other. They did not mingle with the guests walking past them. They moved toward the entrance of the mill with rigid, synchronized steps. The venue coordinator, a bright woman named Sarah, holding a clipboard, intercepted them near the front archway. I watched Sarah smile, point upward toward the bridal suite, and mouth my name. She was offering to escort the mother and sister of the bride upstairs for the final moments of preparation. It was the standard protocol for any normal wedding. Helen did not even break her stride. She raised one hand, waving Sarah off with a dismissive flick of her wrist, and shook her head. They did not ask how I was doing. They did not ask if I needed water or help with my veil. They bypassed the staircase entirely. Instead of walking down the center aisle to claim the reserved front row seats on the bride's side, my family skirted the outer perimeter of the seating area. They walked all the way to the very back row, the furthest possible point from the altar. There were 80 empty chairs in front of them. Yet they chose the absolute margin. They sat down in unison. They were deliberately positioning themselves as spectators rather than participants. I continued to watch them through the glass. The October air outside was crisp, hovering in the low 60s. But Alyssa immediately reached into her purse and retrieved a folded paper program. She began to fan herself dramatically. Pantoiming an intense. Suffocating heat. It was a calculated performance designed to signal her discomfort to anyone looking in her direction. Helen leaned over the empty space between them and whispered something directly into David's ear. David did not respond. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on his expensive leather shoes. His hands folded passively in his lap. They were not treating this like a celebration of my future. They were treating it like a mandatory court appearance. They were serving out a sentence, waiting for the clock to run out so they could retreat to Liu and complain about the verdict. I stepped away from the window. The visual confirmation of their abandonment was complete. I walked over to the full-length antique mirror resting against the cedar wall. I picked up my bouquet from the dressing table. I gripped the stems wrapped in white ribbon. My knuckles turned stark white against the dark green thistles and the scrap of vintage lace. The physical pressure in my hands mirrored the heavy tightening coil in my chest. The room was perfectly silent, but the internal volume was deafening. This was the exact moment they expected me to panic. This was the moment they calculated I would look out the window, see the empty front row, and crumble under the weight of their rejection. They thought the isolation would break me. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the suite ticked with a slow, rhythmic cadence. It was 1258. I focused on my breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4. I let the tension channel down through my arms and out into the floorboards. I was not going to break. I was going to rewrite the ending they had planned for me. At exactly 1:00, a deliberate knock echoed against the thick wood of the suite door. It was not a hesitant tap. It was a knock with intent. "Come in," I said, my voice steady. The door swung open. Thomas stood in the frame. He wore a sharp, tailored navy blue suit that stood in stark contrast to his usual canvas work jackets. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture was impeccably straight. The severe arthritis in his left hand was hidden by the way he rested his arm casually against his side. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, cutting off the faint sound of the string quartet drifting up from the courtyard. He did not look around the room. He did not ask me if I was nervous, or if I had seen my parents sitting in the back row. He knew the layout of the battlefield before he even walked in. He looked directly at me. His gray eyes took in the white dress, the steady grip on the bouquet, and the fierce, unyielding set of my jaw. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. "You look like someone who is ready to start a legacy," he said. The words landed with the weight of an anchor. They wiped away the lingering shadows of my biological family in a single stroke. I let go of the breath I had been holding. I relaxed my grip on the flowers. The blood returned to my knuckles. "Are you ready?" he asked, extending his right arm toward me. "I am ready," I replied. I stepped forward and linked my arm through his. The rough wool of his suit jacket was grounding. It was a tangible texture, something real and solid that I could hold on to. The final countdown had ended. The waiting was over. It was time to walk down the stairs, step out into the sunlight, and show the 3 people sitting in the back row exactly what happens when you leave a void for a better man to fill. We reached the bottom of the wooden staircase. The antechamber on the ground floor was cool and heavily shadowed. Smelling faintly of the damp earth and limestone from the nearby creek, Sarah stood by the heavy iron handles of the massive double doors. Her posture alert. I could hear the low, steady murmur of 120 guests filtering through the thick wood. Then the music started. It was a single, acoustic guitar playing a slow, deliberate melody. It was not a traditional triumphant wedding march. It sounded like something played on a wooden front porch at dusk. It was grounded, honest, and incredibly real. The low hum of conversation outside ceased instantly. I heard the collective rustle of clothing and the scrape of wooden chairs sliding against the stone patio as every single guest rose to their feet. The silence that followed the movement was total. It was the held breath of an entire crowd waiting for the narrative to unfold. Sarah looked at me, gave a sharp, encouraging nod, and pulled the iron handles downward with both hands. The heavy doors swung outward. The midday Missouri sunlight poured into the shadowed antechamber, striking the stone floor like a physical force. Millions of golden dust motes danced in the sudden beam of light, swirling upward in the air currents created by the opening doors. I stood directly in the center of the threshold. The light caught the vintage lace pinned to my bouquet. But the most important visual was the man standing beside me. I did not stand alone. Thomas was anchored to my right side. His posture was perfectly straight, projecting an immovable, quiet strength. The guests turned their heads toward the entrance in perfect unison. I watched the realization wash over the crowd in real time. It happened in a series of micro-expressions, moving from the front rows to the back, like a visible wave of electricity. Caleb had a large extended family filling the left side of the aisle. Many of them had never met my biological parents or heard the details of our fractured history. They simply saw a bride and a dignified older man preparing to escort her. But my side of the aisle contained people who knew the truth. I saw my accountant, a practical woman who helped me secure the bindery loan years ago, press a hand flat against her chest in surprise. I saw the owner of the local antique shop, a man who supplied me with damaged manuscripts for restoration, wipe a sudden tear from his eye. They recognized Thomas immediately. They knew he was the landlord of my commercial building. They knew he was not David Russell. The hushed, rapid whisper of realization rippled through my section of the chairs, transforming confusion into fierce protective support. I focused my attention on the physical world to keep myself grounded. I felt the rough wool of the navy blue suit beneath my fingertips. The fabric was coarse and warm against my palm. It was a tangible, undeniable reminder that I was tethered to someone who actively chose to be here. I applied a slight pressure to his arm. We took the first step forward onto the stone pathway. The pacing was slow and meticulously measured. Left, right, left. We moved in perfect synchronization. Thomas did not rush the moment. He guided our momentum with the steady rhythm of a man who understood the profound importance of the journey. I kept my chin level. I did not look down at the hem of my white dress or study the uneven flagstones beneath my heels. I looked straight ahead toward the altar. Caleb was waiting under the wooden arbor. He wore a dark, fitted suit, his hands clasped firmly in front of him. His broad shoulders, usually tensed from the demands of the firehouse, were completely relaxed. As I drew closer, I could see the distinct shine of moisture gathering in his eyes. He did not look surprised to see Thomas walking beside me. He looked deeply, profoundly moved. Caleb understood the exact weight of this moment. He knew the biological family I was leaving behind, and he knew the gravity of the chosen family stepping up to fill the void. He held my gaze, and the emotional connection between us felt like a locked deadbolt. The foundation was solid. But the story of this aisle was not just about the man waiting at the end of it. It was also about the man sitting at the very beginning of it. As we reached the 10th mark along the stone path, I allowed my eyes to shift away from the altar for a fraction of a second. I purposefully panned my vision to the back row, to the extreme margin of the venue where my biological family had isolated themselves. I needed to see the result of their cruel calculation. My father spent 30 years working as a claims adjuster for a corporate insurance firm. His entire career was built on evaluating liability, minimizing risk, and managing public optics. David viewed every human interaction through a rigid ledger of potential gains and losses. When he called me 24 hours ago to abandon his role in the ceremony, he had run the numbers. He assumed the risk to his reputation was minimal. He calculated that I would walk alone, thereby absorbing the humiliation and keeping the family secret completely intact. He believed his absence would be a quiet internal tragedy that no one outside of our immediate circle would notice or understand. He planned to sit in the back row looking dignified, playing the role of a grieving patriarch, granting his daughter independent space while honoring his other daughter's delicate emotional needs. He was entirely wrong. His entire calculation disintegrated the moment Thomas stepped through those heavy wooden doors. I caught the exact second David realized he had been replaced. We were 15 feet down the aisle, walking with steady, undeniable purpose. David was seated in the aisle chair. His face, usually set in a permanent mask of professional indifference, went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking ashen and hollow. His hands, which had been resting passively in his lap, suddenly gripped the metal armrests of his folding chair with desperate force. He half stood. It was an involuntary muscle reaction, a jarring, clumsy movement that threw him off balance. He hovered a few inches above his seat, his mouth slightly open, staring at the man occupying the physical space he had willingly surrendered. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his house burn to the ground because he forgot to lock the front door. The illusion of his control shattered into 1,000 pieces right there in the back row. He was not a dignified patriarch granting space. He was a coward, watching another man perform his most basic duty. Everyone in the venue saw it happen. The guests who knew the family dynamic were turning around in their seats, staring directly at him. Their expressions ranged from cold, hard judgment to outright pity. Next to him, Helen sat perfectly rigid. Her face was frozen into a tight, terrifying grimace. The social currency she guarded so fiercely was burning to ash in front of her eyes. She could not spin this narrative. She could not lean over to a neighbor and smoothly explain away the presence of a retired history teacher walking her youngest daughter to the altar. The optics were completely indefensible. Alyssa had stopped fanning herself. The paper program hung limply from her fingers. Forgotten. Her dark sunglasses could not hide the severe downward drop of her jaw. Her ultimate power play. The theatrical tantrum designed to sabotage my joy and keep herself positioned at the center of the family universe had failed spectacularly. Instead of creating a pathetic, lonely bride for people to quietly pity, she had created a scenario where her sister looked surrounded by fiercely protective loyalty. The spotlight she craved was now illuminating her profound selfishness. I turned my eyes away from the back row and fixed them back on Caleb. The transaction was complete. They had made their choice. And now, they had to sit in the cheap folding chairs they had selected and watched the consequences unfold in real time. Thomas and I continued our walk. The rough wool of his sleeve remained a constant grounding force against my palm. Left. Right. Left. We passed the halfway point of the aisle. The acoustic guitar reached a resonant swelling chord that echoed beautifully off the stone walls of the mill. The energy in the crisp autumn air shifted from quiet reverence to something far more electric and dangerous. The tension was no longer about a bride walking toward her groom. The tension was now centered on the explosive reality of the reception that would immediately follow the ceremony. My mother never accepted defeat gracefully. Helen viewed every public slight as an act of war that required an immediate and disproportionate response. I knew her mind was already racing behind her frozen smile. She was actively calculating how to corner me the moment the ceremony concluded. She would demand an explanation. She would attempt to twist my survival into a malicious, premeditated attack against the family reputation. The quiet, solemn steps I was taking right now were leading directly toward a brutal confrontation on the outdoor patio. The ceremony was going to be beautiful, but the cocktail hour was going to be a battlefield. We reached the front row. Caleb took a half step forward from the arbor, closing the final distance between us. The music began to fade into a soft, lingering vibration that hummed in the stone beneath our feet. The guests remained standing, wrapped in the profound, heavy silence of the moment. I released my grip on the navy suit jacket, preparing to face the man I was going to marry. Knowing the true test of this new foundation was only minutes away. The distance from the heavy iron handles of the double doors to the wooden arbor at the front of the room was exactly 50 feet. I knew this measurement because I had paced it out myself months ago when calculating the layout for the floral arrangements. Under normal circumstances, 50 feet is a trivial distance. You can cross it in seconds without a second thought. But walking those 50 feet across the reclaimed timber flooring of the old stone mill felt like traversing a lifetime. It felt like I was crossing a vast canyon that separated two entirely different worlds. With every single step forward, I was putting measurable physical distance between the toxic history behind me and the healthy future waiting ahead. The acoustics inside the historic limestone building amplified the sound of my low heels striking the wood. The rhythm was sharp and steady. Click. Pause. Click. Pause. It synchronized perfectly with the unyielding cadence of Thomas walking beside me. He did not waver. He did not rush the pace to escape the uncomfortable stares of the crowd. He moved with the deliberate, measured grace of a man who knew his physical presence was the only shield I needed. He was walking me through the fire, and he was making sure everyone in the room saw it happen. As we passed the middle rows of the venue, I saw the genuine emotional toll this silent rebellion was taking on the people who actually loved me. Caleb had a vast network of loud and joyful relatives filling the left side of the aisle. But my side was carefully curated and intentionally small. It consisted of women who ran local Missouri businesses, artisans who understood the value of exhausting manual labor, and loyal friends who had watched me survive the freezing winters in my unheated bindery. I saw my friend Clara standing near the aisle. Clara is a ceramicist who helped me pack cardboard boxes when I finally moved out of my parents' house 10 years ago. She knew every detail of my family dynamic. She was openly weeping, pressing a plain linen handkerchief against her face to stifle the sound. A few feet away stood Caleb's mother, Brenda. Brenda is a woman who routinely pulls heavy tractor engines apart with her bare hands. She manages a 300-acre agricultural property and is not prone to delicate displays of emotion, yet tears were streaming freely down her weathered cheeks. She understood the profound bone-deep rejection I had endured over the last 24 hours. She also understood the incredible dignity of the retired history teacher walking me away from it. The emotional warmth radiating from these front rows stood in stark contrast to the freezing hostility radiating from the extreme rear of the room. I did not need to turn my head to know exactly how Helen was reacting. The entire population of our tight-knit community was currently watching a blue-collar landlord step up because a wealthy corporate insurance executive was too cowardly to do his duty. The optics of the situation were an undeniable social catastrophe for my mother. Helen had spent her entire adult life curating a pristine image of upper-middle-class perfection in lieu. She sat on prestigious local charity boards. She hosted seasonal garden parties, where the primary currency was gossip and perceived status. Now, 120 guests were witnessing her ultimate failure as a matriarch. I could feel the heat of her fury burning through the crowd. Her jaw was undoubtedly clenched, so tight her teeth were grinding together. And Alyssa was finally facing a narrative she could not manipulate or control. Her power play had backfired with spectacular precision. She had demanded my father step down to force me into a posture of solitary humiliation. She wanted me to look pathetic and abandoned, so she could remain the tragic focal point of the weekend. She wanted guests to whisper about my lonely walk and pity her delicate emotional state. Instead, she had handed me the most triumphant, emotionally resonant entrance possible. Her slate gray dress and dark sunglasses now just made her look petty, bitter, and entirely isolated. She was a fading shadow at the back of a room that was suddenly filled with intense light. We reached the edge of the wooden arbor. The acoustic guitar music transitioned into a final resonant chord and then slowly faded into the natural ambient sounds of the mill. The rushing water of the creek outside, mixed with the quiet held breath of the guests. The officiant was a retired local magistrate named William. He had a stern face but kind eyes. He stepped forward, holding a heavy leather-bound journal I had meticulously restored for him a year prior. The venue went entirely silent. You could hear the faint rustle of the dry autumn leaves, blowing against the limestone exterior walls. William looked out over the assembled crowd. He cleared his throat. The traditional script of a wedding ceremony is designed to be seamless and predictable. But today, every single word carried the dangerous weight of a loaded weapon. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" William asked. His voice echoed off the high cedar ceiling, filling every corner of the room. The traditional response to that question is a simple 2 words: "I do." It is usually spoken softly by the biological father before he quickly retreats to his designated seat. But Thomas did not say "I do." He did not claim ownership of me because a chosen father understands that respect is earned through labor, not demanded by tradition. Thomas turned slightly to face the crowd. He wanted his voice to carry all the way to the back row where my parents were sitting. "She gives herself," Thomas said. His voice was loud, clear, and steady, but her chosen family stands with her. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the guests. It was a beautiful, devastating declaration of independence. It publicly severed my biological ties and validated the people who had actually shown up to support me. Clara let out a soft sob. Brenda nodded her head in fierce, silent agreement. Thomas turned to face me. He did not kiss my cheek or make a theatrical display of affection. He offered a single nod of profound, unwavering respect. He took my right hand, his callous fingers rough and familiar, against my skin, and gently placed it into Caleb's waiting hand. Caleb gripped my fingers tightly. Caleb looked directly at Thomas and murmured a quiet thank you. Thomas stepped back. He turned away from the altar and walked toward the bride's side of the aisle. The front row center seat was empty. It was the premium chair traditionally reserved for the father of the bride. A small white card resting on the wooden seat bore the name David Russell. I had printed that card on heavy cardstock months ago when I still believed my father might show up for me. Thomas did not hesitate. He picked up the place card, folded it neatly in half, slipped it into his suit jacket pocket, and sat down in the chair. He claimed the physical space David was supposed to fill. He claimed the role David was supposed to play. The ceremony began. William started speaking about the foundation of a strong, enduring marriage. I kept my eyes focused on Caleb. I listened to the vows we had written for each other. I felt the warmth of his hands holding mine. It was the most profound grounding moment of my life. But even as I stood in the sunlight filtering through the arched windows, I could feel the dark, vibrating energy gathering at the back of the room. The biological family I had just publicly discarded was not going to leave the venue quietly. Helen was a woman who demanded the last word in every conflict. And she was currently watching her social empire crumble into dust. The vows would soon end. The rings would be exchanged. We would be pronounced husband and wife, and then the guests would transition to the outdoor stone patio for the cocktail hour. The quiet, reverent space of the ceremony was about to dissolve into a highly volatile social arena. I knew Helen was already plotting her ambush. She was waiting for the exact moment I stepped away from Caleb to corner me near the edge of the property line. She was preparing to unleash a storm of guilt and rage to reestablish her dominance. The beautiful, solemn piece of the altar was merely the eye of the hurricane. And the real storm was waiting for me outside. William stepped back, allowing the physical space around Caleb and me to close. The ambient noise in the stone mill settled into a thick, expectant hush. The ceremony was moving into its most critical phase. Standing at the altar, I could feel a profound grounding warmth radiating from the man holding my hands. The contrast between this space and the back row of the venue was sharp enough to cut glass. At the front of the room, there was honesty, vulnerability, and chosen loyalty. 50 feet behind us, there was bitter resentment and a desperate clinging to social status. Caleb reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He did not hire a professional writer to craft a polished theatrical monologue. He wrote his vows himself. Sitting at the kitchen table of his apartment, after a grueling shift at Station 42, he unfolded the paper. His hands, usually so steady when starting an intravenous line or stabilizing a fractured collarbone, trembled slightly. He cleared his throat and looked directly into my eyes. He spoke about the reality of his profession. Caleb spends his days navigating the worst moments of other people's lives. He told the crowd that his job requires him to witness how easily human lives can shatter under sudden impact. He sees broken things every single day. Because of that, he is inherently skeptical of anything that looks too perfect on the surface. He knows that perfection is usually a fragile veneer, hiding structural damage. Then he talked about the first time he walked into my binder. He described the heavy scent of raw leather and the fine layer of paper dust coating the floorboards. He painted a picture of me standing at the workbench. I had a smudge of charcoal across my forehead, and I was using a bone folder to press a new spine onto a ruined waterlogged 19th century journal. Caleb told the room that he watched me work for 10 minutes before I even noticed he was there. He said he realized in that exact moment that I was not someone who threw away damaged things. He was a restorer. I was someone who recognized the inherent value in things that other people considered ruined. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," Caleb said, his voice echoing off the limestone walls. "You do not demand a perfect life. You just demand an honest one. I promise to be the safe harbor you have spent your entire life building for other people. I promise to protect your peace with the same fierce dedication you use to protect those fragile pages. You will never have to rebuild your foundation alone again." The room was perfectly still. The sincerity of his words anchored everyone present. I saw Brenda wipe another tear from her cheek, her chin raised in fierce pride for her son. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the weight of his promise settle into my chest. It was my turn. I did not have a piece of paper. I had memorized the words while standing in my shop over the last 3 weeks. My vows were written in the vocabulary of my trade, utilizing the language of architecture, preservation, and structural integrity. Every sentence carried a deliberate double meaning. They were a sacred promise to the man standing in front of me. But they were also a quiet, devastating indictment of the conditional love sitting 50 feet away. I promised to build a foundation with Caleb that would not crumble under external pressure. I told him that a strong spine requires flexible joints, and the right adhesive, just like a marriage, requires compromise and unwavering loyalty. I promised to love him in a way that did not calculate risk or demand a public performance. I promised to never trade your dignity for my own comfort. I said, letting my voice carry through the silent room. I promise to stand beside you when the weather is brutal, not just when the sun is shining. I will not abandon my post when things become difficult. I choose you today, and I will choose you every day after, because a family is built by the people who stay in the room when the heavy lifting begins. The impact of those specific phrases hit the audience like a physical wave. The guests who understood the context of my family dynamic recognized the sharp edge hidden beneath the beautiful sentiment. Clara lowered her handkerchief and smiled, a fierce, knowing smile. Thomas sat in the front row, his posture rigid and proud, acknowledging the boundary I had just publicly cemented. I knew the exact effect those words were having on the back row. David had traded my dignity for his comfort. Helen had demanded a public performance at the rehearsal dinner. They had abandoned their posts when the emotional weather became inconvenient. I was using my vows to legally bind myself to a good man while simultaneously drawing a permanent line in the sand against the toxic culture of my childhood. I was locking the door and throwing away the key. William smiled. Recognizing the profound weight of the exchange, he asked for the rings. Caleb slid a plain brushed tungsten band onto my finger. I placed a matching band onto his. The metal was heavy and solid. Cool to the touch, William placed his hands over ours and spoke the final traditional words of the ceremony. He pronounced us husband and wife. Caleb leaned in and kissed me. It was a grounded, certain kiss. When we pulled apart, the venue erupted. The applause was not the polite, measured clapping of a formal country club event. It was deafening. It was a roar of physical release from 120 people who had just witnessed a profound victory over generational dysfunction. The sound bounced off the cedar ceiling and the limestone walls, filling the entire space with vibrant, undeniable joy. The acoustic guitar music flared back up, playing an upbeat driving rhythm. Caleb and I turned to face the crowd. We linked our hands together. It was time for the recessional. It was time to walk back up the 50-foot aisle. The walk toward the altar had been a solemn march of reclamation. Guided by Thomas, the walk back was a victory lap. We stepped off the wooden arbor and began moving down the stone pathway. The faces of the guests were illuminated with genuine happiness. People reached out to touch our shoulders as we passed. I caught Thomas' eye as we walked by the front row. He gave me a slow, proud wink. We continued down the aisle, moving closer to the heavy double doors at the rear of the mill. The physical distance between us and my biological family closed rapidly. 40 fet. 30 ft. 10 fe. As we approached the final row, I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not avert my eyes, but I also did not offer them the satisfaction of a lingering glare. I observed them with the clinical detachment of a stranger passing a mildly interesting display in a museum window. David was staring intently at the floor. He refused to make eye contact with me or with Caleb. He looked at the scuff marks on his expensive Italian leather shoes. His shoulders slumped forward in a posture of total defeat. His cowardice was entirely complete. He could not even muster the courage to look his youngest daughter in the eye on her wedding day. Next to him, Helen was practically vibrating with rage. The polite artificial mask she wore for polite society had completely melted away. Her jaw was locked, and her eyes burned with a cold, furious intensity. She glared at me as we walked past her expression, promising a brutal reckoning. Alyssa sat beside her, looking small and bitter, her slate gray dress blending into the shadows of the back corner. We glided right past them. I did not break my stride for a single fraction of a second. I felt an incredible soaring sensation of extreme lightness. For 31 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their expectations, their conditional approval, and their endless demands. Walking past them without stopping felt like dropping a 100B rucksack onto the floor. They were no longer the authors of my story. They were just 3 unhappy guests sitting in the back row of a party. They did not understand. Caleb and I crossed the threshold into the shadowed antechamber and stepped out through the exterior doors onto the outdoor stone patio. The October sunlight was bright and warming. The creek rushed by in the background, a steady natural soundtrack to our new beginning. But the enforced silence of the ceremony was officially over. The guests were beginning to file out of the mill, transitioning into the cocktail hour. Trays of local Missouri beer and smoked appetizers were circulating. The joyful, chaotic energy of the reception was taking hold. And Helen was finally off her leash. She had been forced to sit in silent humiliation for 45 minutes. She had watched her social standing take a massive hit. She had listened to my vows publicly dissect her failures as a mother. She was not going to get into her silver sedan and drive back to Liu quietly. The beautiful, solemn piece of the altar was behind me. I turned toward the edge of the property line, squeezing Caleb's hand, knowing my mother was already moving through the crowd to corner me. The transition from the heavy silence of the ceremony to the vibrant energy of the reception happened the moment we stepped onto the outdoor patio. The stone terrace wrapped around the rear of the limestone mill, bordered by a low retaining wall built from river rocks. Above us, strands of simple Edison bulbs were strung back and forth across the cedar beams, casting a warm golden glow as the October sun began its slow descent behind the treeing. The air carried a distinct chill now, but it was cut by the rich, heavy scent of hickory smoke and roasted meat. We had hired a local barbecue smokehouse to cater the event, and their sprawling iron smokers were operating at full capacity near the edge of the property. Wait staff moved effortlessly through the crowd, carrying wide wooden trays loaded with local Missouri craft, stout, pale ales, and signature cocktails served in mismatched vintage glassware. The guests were laughing, shaking off the intense emotional weight of the vows and leaning into the celebration. Caleb's relatives congregated near the outdoor bar, their voices booming with easy joy. Thomas stood near the creek edge, holding a cup of black coffee, quietly observing the scene with a look of profound satisfaction. It was a grounded, honest environment. It lacked the sterile, performative elegance of a Liu country club, which meant it was the exact kind of space my mother despised. I was standing near the far end of the patio with Caleb finishing our portrait session with the photographer. We had moved away from the main cluster of guests to capture the fading natural light reflecting off the moving water of the creek. The photographer needed to switch lenses and asked us to take a short break. Caleb received a firm tap on the shoulder from his older brother, who insisted on pulling him away for a quick photograph with their grandparents. Caleb squeezed my hand, promised he would be right back, and walked toward the center of the terrace. I was left standing alone against the river rock retaining wall. I placed my hands on the rough, uneven stones, letting the cold seep into my palms. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, taking a deep breath of the wood smoke and the damp earth. When I opened my eyes, Helen was already moving toward me. She navigated through the joyful crowd like a shark, cutting through open water. She did not carry a drink. She did not stop to offer polite greetings to the guests she passed. Her posture was rigid, her silk shawl pulled tight across her shoulders like armor. She tracked my location, calculated the distance from the nearest group of people, and recognized that I was temporarily isolated. It was the precise tactical advantage she had been waiting for since the moment Thomas stood up from the front row. She stopped 2 feet in front of me, invading my personal space to establish physical dominance. She positioned her back toward the party, ensuring no one else could read her facial expression. Her face was a masterclass in controlled fury. The polite, superficial smile she wore for high society was gone. Her jaw was locked tight, pulling the skin taut across her cheekbones. "How dare you embarrass your father like that?" she hissed. Her voice was barely a whisper, pitched low to avoid detection, but it carried the sharp sting of a physical strike. "You made a mockery of this family in front of half the county." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I kept my hands resting flat on the cold stones of the retaining wall. I studied her face, observing the frantic, desperate energy radiating from her eyes. 10 years ago, a confrontation like this would have sent my heart racing into my throat. I would have stumbled over my words, apologizing, trying to mitigate her anger. Now I watched her deploy her guilt tactics with the clinical detachment of a mechanic listening to a failing engine. "I did not embarrass Dad," I replied calmly. My voice was flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. "He embarrassed himself." Helen narrowed her eyes. "You intentionally orchestrated a spectacle to humiliate him. You replaced him with a stranger just to settle a petty score. You knew everyone in town would whisper about it." I tilted my head, refusing to break eye contact. He had a reserved seat waiting for him in the front row. "Mom." I printed the card myself. He chose to sit in the back row. He chose to stay seated when the doors opened. I just chose a man who actually wanted to stand up. The undeniable logic of the statement hit her like a wall. She could not argue the sequence of events because she had orchestrated them herself. She had calculated that I would walk alone. She had never factored in the possibility that I possessed a safety net she did not control. Realizing her initial attack had failed to draw blood, Helen pivoted immediately to her most reliable weapon. She deployed the golden child. "Your sister is currently locked inside a bathroom stall," Helen said, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "She is crying so hard she can barely breathe. Your little performance at the altar, those vows you decided to broadcast to the entire room, were incredibly triggering for her. You know her marriage is falling apart. You know she is in a fragile state, and yet you stood up there and flaunted your happiness like a weapon." I listened to the words dissecting the manipulation in real time. Helen was attempting to make me responsible for Alyssa's emotional regulation. She was demanding that I feel guilt for experiencing joy on my own wedding day, simply because my sister was experiencing the consequences of her own life choices. It was the same twisted dynamic they had enforced since we were children. My success was always framed as a threat to Alyssa's self-esteem. My milestones were always required to shrink so Alyssa could feel tall. Helen waited for my response. She expected me to fold. She expected the deeply ingrained conditioning of my childhood to kick in. She wanted me to ask how Alyssa was doing to offer an apology, or to rush to the restroom to comfort a 3-4-year-old woman throwing a tantrum at someone else's celebration. I looked at my mother. I felt the cool Missouri breeze lift a stray strand of hair from my neck. I delivered a devastating emotionless reality check. "Then she should go home," I said. Helen froze. Her mouth opened slightly. But no, sound emerged. "If the ceremony was too triggering for her to handle, she needs to leave." I continued, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "The parking lot is right behind you. Her car is only 50 yards away. No one is forcing her to stay here and suffer. Mom, if she is in pain, Take her home. Helen was left entirely speechless. The gears of her manipulation locked up and ground to a halt. Her usual tactics, guilt, shame, and the threat of family disapproval were bouncing harmlessly off my newfound armor. She had no counter-argument for total indifference. She could not force me to care. She could not force me to play the game anymore. She stared at me for 3 long seconds, realizing for the first time in her life that she possessed zero leverage over her youngest daughter. The social currency she used to buy compliance was worthless in my economy. Her face flushed a deep mottled red. She turned on her heel and marched away, heading straight for the side door that led to the indoor restrooms. She needed to retrieve her golden child and regroup. I watched her walk away. I did not feel the lingering sting of adrenaline. I felt an incredible, profound peace. I turned back toward the creek, watching the water rush over the smooth stones. Caleb appeared beside me a moment later, slipping his arm around my waist. He asked if everything was all right. I leaned my head against his shoulder, smelling the faint trace of cedar on his suit jacket. I told him everything was perfect, but I knew the silence was only temporary. My mother was retreating, but she was not surrendering. Her ego had sustained a massive blow, and the damage meant she would inevitably unleash Alyssa. Alyssa would not remain hidden in the bathroom stall for the rest of the evening. She fed on attention, and a closed door offered none. The reception timeline was moving forward. The caterers were signaling that dinner was ready to be served in the main hall. The guests were beginning to file inside to find their tables. The toasts were scheduled to occur right after the main course. The microphone would be turned on. The entire room would be seated and focused on the head table. It was the perfect stage for someone desperate to reclaim the narrative. I walked inside with my husband, knowing my sister was preparing to make her final desperate move. The sun dipped below the treeing, signaling the end of the cocktail hour. The venue staff opened the interior doors of the stone mill, ushering the guests inside for the dinner reception. The main hall was a cavernous space. The ceiling was supported by exposed timber trusses. Long rectangular tables were draped in heavy white linen and lined with dark wooden crossback chairs. The room smelled of carved hickory, smoked brisket, roasted root vegetables, and the faint Caleb and I sat at a small sweetheart table positioned near the center of the room. We ate our meal in relative peace. The guests were engaged in lively conversation. Waiters moved efficiently through the narrow aisles, pouring coffee and clearing empty ceramic dinner plates. The timeline, Sarah, the coordinator, had built, was running with flawless precision. Dinner was concluding. The next item on the schedule was the formal toasts. Caleb's older brother, serving as the best man, was already reviewing his handwritten notes. Clara, my maid of honor, was adjusting her microphone pack, but Alyssa operated on her own timeline. She possessed a terrifying radar for shifting attention. She could feel the ambient focus of the room, preparing to center on Caleb and me for the speeches. For a woman whose entire identity was tied to being the focal point of every room she entered this upcoming block of time, was intolerable. She had failed to ruin the ceremony. Her mother had failed to intimidate me on the patio. Alyssa was running out of options to reclaim the narrative. I saw her stand up from the back corner table. She held a half-empty wine glass in her left hand. She picked up a silver dessert fork with her right. She did not walk over to our table to offer a private congratulation. She walked straight toward the small wooden podium, set up near the edge of the dance floor. Sarah had left a wireless microphone resting in the plastic clip on the stand. Alyssa stepped up to the podium. She raised the silver fork and struck the side of her wine glass 3 times. Ping. Bing. Ping. The sharp metallic ring and cut through the low hum of the dining hall. Conversations halted mid-sentence. 120 guests turned their heads toward the front of the room, expecting to see Caleb's brother, or Clara, stepping up to speak. Instead, they saw a woman in a slate-gray dress, her posture slightly swaying, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, despite the dim indoor lighting. Alyssa pulled the microphone from the clip. She fumbled with the switch for a second before the green light clicked on. The speakers mounted high on the limestone walls emitted a brief burst of static. "Hello, everyone," she said. Her voice was amplified, bouncing off the hard surfaces of the room. It was thick and uneven. She was slurring her words, the result of consuming steady glasses of house red wine since she arrived. "I know I am not on the official schedule, but as the older sister of the bride, I felt it was my duty to say a few words about love tonight." I sat back in my chair. Caleb tensed beside me, his jaw tightening. I placed a hand on his forearm, signaling him to wait. I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to dig her own grave. Love is a very difficult thing. Alyssa continued, gripping the edges of the wooden podium to steady herself. "People stand up here and they make promises. They wear white dresses and they smile for photographs. But no one tells you how fast the floor can drop out from under you. No one tells you that the person you build a life with can just wake up one day and decide you are not enough." The temperature in the room plummeted. The polite, expectant smiles on the faces of the guests vanished. The collective discomfort was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Alyssa was no longer talking about my wedding. She had hijacked a microphone in front of a room full of strangers to deliver a drunken eulogy for her own pending divorce. She was bleeding out on a public stage. In her professional life, Alyssa managed corporate public relations. Snorts, she handled crisis communications for multi-million-dollar brands. She knew better than anyone how to craft a polished, acceptable narrative. But right now, the toxic rot of our family dynamic had stripped away all of her professional discipline. She was just a desperate, unhappy woman demanding that 100 people stop celebrating and look at her pain. But she was not finished. She needed a villain for her story. And I was the most convenient target. And family is supposed to be the safety net when that floor drops, she said, her voice rising in pitch, turning sharp and accusatory. "You are supposed to be able to rely on the people who share your blood. But some people do not appreciate the family they have. Some people throw away their own flesh and blood because they think they can just replace them with strangers. They think loyalty is something you can just swap out when you want to make a point." She pointed a trembling finger in my direction. The guests followed her gesture. I did not avert my gaze. I looked back at her with flat clinical detachment. "You sit there looking so proud," Valerie Alyssa sneered into the microphone. "But you have no idea what real loss feels like. You turned your back on the people who raised you today. You humiliated our father. You should be ashamed." I shifted my vision to the back corner table. I wanted to see how the architects of this monster were reacting to her performance. David was physically shrinking into his chair. He was staring down at his lap, his shoulders hunched, praying for the floor to open up and swallow him. He was a man who lived his entire life terrified of public embarrassment, and his golden child was currently delivering the ultimate social catastrophe. Helen was sitting next to him. She looked mildly panicked. Her eyes darted around the room, reading the horrified expressions of the guests. But she did not stand up. She did not walk over to the podium to gently guide her intoxicated daughter away from the microphone. Even now, watching Alyssa detonate a social grenade in the middle of a formal reception, Helen was paralyzed by her inability to discipline her favorite child. She would rather watch the room burn than tell Alyssa no. The silence in the dining hall was agonizing. Alyssa stood at the podium, breathing heavily into the microphone, waiting for a reaction. She wanted me to yell. She wanted me to cry. She wanted a screaming match that would validate her victimhood and center the entire evening around her trauma. I refused to give her the ammunition. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head to the left, looking at the DJ booth situated near the edge of the dance floor. The DJ was a young man in his 20s. He looked caught in the headlights, unsure if he should intervene in a family dispute. I caught his eye. I raised my right hand and made a sharp horizontal cutting motion across my throat. The DJ nodded once. He reached down to his mixing board and pushed a single sliding lever all the way to the bottom. Alyssa opened her mouth to speak again. I just want everyone to know that she started, but her voice did not echo through the speakers. The microphone was dead. She tapped the metal grill against her palm. Confused, she looked down at the green light. She spoke into it again. But her voice was just a weak, unamplified sound that barely reached the first row of tables. Her weapon had been neutralized. That was when Caleb stood up. He did not move with anger. He did not storm across the room like a bouncer, preparing for a physical altercation. He shifted instantly into his paramedic mode. Caleb spends his working life managing volatile, intoxicated, and uncooperative subjects in high-stress environments. He knows how to de-escalate a situation using nothing but physical presence and unwavering vocal authority. He walked across the wooden dance floor. The guests watched him move in total silence. He reached the podium. He did not look at the crowd. He did not address the room to apologize for the interruption. He stepped directly into Alyssa's personal space, forcing her to look up at him. Alyssa shrank back slightly. Without the amplification of the speakers, she suddenly looked very small. Caleb leaned in. He kept his voice low, ensuring only Alyssa could hear the words. But his tone was harder than the limestone walls surrounding us. Alyssa, you are done, Caleb said quietly. She opened her mouth, her lip trembling. You cannot tell me to sit down, Caleb interrupted his voice, dropping an octave, leaving zero room for negotiation. Sit down or leave. Those are your only two options. Pick one right now. Alyssa stared at him. She searched his face for any sign of hesitation, any crack in his armor that she could exploit with tears or guilt. She found nothing but cold professional finality. The sheer unbothered authority of the boundary was something she had never encountered in her entire life. Our parents had never spoken to her like that. They had always bargained with her. Caleb was not bargaining. Her face crumbled. The arrogant, accusatory sneer dissolved into genuine, humiliated panic. She dropped the dead microphone onto the podium. It landed with a dull thud. She turned around and walked away, her heels clicking unsteadily against the floorboards. She did not return to the back corner table. She walked straight past. Our parents pushed open the side exit door and disappeared into the night. Caleb picked up the microphone from the podium, walked over to the DJ booth, and handed it back. He nodded to his brother to prepare for the actual toasts. Then he walked back to our table, sat down next to me, and calmly picked up his coffee cup. The room exhaled. The tension vanished, replaced by a deep collective respect for the way the hazard had been cleared. The toxicity had tried to infect the room, and it had been cleanly, surgically removed. The reception was ours again. The immediate aftermath of Alyssa fleeing the room was a collective exhale. The DJ seamlessly transitioned back to a low acoustic playlist, washing over the lingering tension. Waitstaff returned to their duties, collecting the last of the dinner plates. Caleb sat next to me, his posture completely relaxed, sipping his coffee. as if he had just completed a routine task at the firehouse. He did not ask for validation or praise. He simply recognized a hazard and neutralized it. However, my mother did not share his pragmatic approach to crisis management. Helen was incapable of letting a slight go unanswered. And in her mind, Caleb had just committed the ultimate act of aggression. He had publicly disciplined the golden child. He had established a boundary that superseded Helen's authority. I watched her from across the room. She was sitting next to David, who was still staring at the tablecloth. Helen's face was flushed, a dark, angry crimson. She snatched her silk shawl from the back of her chair and stood up. She did not walk toward the exit to check on Alyssa. She did not walk toward the head table to confront me. She turned her sights on Caleb's family. Helen operated under the assumption that all families functioned like hers, where the matriarch held absolute power and dictated the terms of every interaction. She believed she could leverage her social status and perceived victimhood to divide and conquer. She assumed she could approach Caleb's parents and paint me as the antagonist, expecting them to sympathize with her manufactured plight and perhaps reprimand their son for his lack of decorum. She marched toward the large rectangular table, located near the front of the dining hall, where Brenda and the rest of Caleb's immediate relatives were seated. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening slightly. Caleb noticed my movement and followed my gaze. He let out a low, amused huff of breath. "Your mother is about to make a significant tactical error," Caleb murmured, setting his coffee cup down. I watched Helen arrive at the table. She positioned herself directly behind Brenda's chair, interrupting a lively conversation between Caleb's father and his uncle. Brenda was mid-sentence, holding a glass of iced tea. She paused, turned her head, and looked up at Helen. Brenda does not manage corporate communications or sit on country club charity boards. She manages a 300-acre soybean farm. She wakes up before dawn, monitors commodity markets, and negotiates with heavy machinery vendors. She evaluates people based entirely on their utility and their integrity. She possesses absolutely zero tolerance for theatrical nonsense. Helen leaned in, her voice pitched loud enough for the entire table to hear. She was projecting the aura of a deeply offended aristocrat, forced to endure the presence of the uncultured masses. "I need to speak with you regarding your son's behavior," Helen said, her tone dripping with condescension. The level of disrespect he just displayed toward my oldest daughter was completely unacceptable. "We are currently navigating a very sensitive family matter, and his aggressive intervention was uncalled for." Brenda did not stand up. She did not look intimidated. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced tea, swallowed, and then set the glass down on the white linen tablecloth. She turned her body in the chair to face Helen fully. Helen, assuming Brenda's silence was an invitation to continue, launched into her prepared monologue. She attempted to reframe the entire evening. She painted Valerie as a rebellious, dramatic daughter who intentionally orchestrated a humiliating spectacle at the altar just to hurt her father. She framed Alyssa as a fragile victim suffering through a terrible tragedy, merely seeking a moment of understanding from her sister. She expected Brenda to nod sympathetically, to apologize for Caleb's forceful actions, and to acknowledge Helen's superior social standing. Brenda let her talk for exactly 30 seconds. Then she raised her right-hand palm facing outward. It was a gesture, typically used to halt a reversing tractor. "That is enough," Patricia Brenda said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the unyielding density of a stone wall. Helen blinked, momentarily, derailed by the deliberate use of the wrong name. "My name is Helen." She corrected her voice tight. Brenda did not correct herself. She looked Helen up and down a slow, methodical assessment that found the woman standing in front of her entirely lacking I do not care what your name is, Brenda said flatly. I care about what I just witnessed. Your husband refused to walk his own blood down the aisle because you were too busy coddling a 34-year-old woman throwing a tantrum. You allowed your oldest daughter to stand at a podium and try to ruin a celebration because she cannot handle not being the center of attention. Helen opened her mouth, her face turning a mottled purple. But Brenda leaned forward, cutting her off before she could speak a single syllable. In my house, we protect our kids. Brenda continued, her tone hardening into cold steel. We do not sacrifice them to keep the peace. We do not use them as meat shields for someone else's ego. Caleb did exactly what he was raised to do. He protected his wife from a hazard. You have no idea what you are talking about. Helen hissed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. You do not understand the complexities of our family. I understand exactly what kind of family you are, Brenda replied, her gaze unwavering. You are cowards. You trade your dignity for comfort. And you expect everyone else to pay the bill. Well, the tab is closed here. Valerie is part of this family now. We value her foundation, not her compliance. Brenda picked up her iced tea, signaling that the conversation was permanently terminated. Now go sit down before I ask the venue security to remove you for disturbing the peace. Helen stood frozen behind the chair. It was the first time in her adult life she had been completely and publicly dismantled by an absolute peer. She could not leverage her wealth, her zip code, or her carefully constructed social narrative against a woman who simply did not care about any of those things. Brenda possessed a different kind of currency, one built on undeniable truth and unshakable loyalty. And Helen's artificial coins were useless in this exchange. The surrounding guests at the table were completely silent, watching the interaction with varying degrees of shock and profound satisfaction. Helen looked around, searching for a sympathetic face, a crack in the armor she could exploit. She found nothing but cold, judging stares. The realization of her total powerlessness finally registered. Her empire had not just crumbled, it had been swept into the dustpan. Helen spun around and walked back toward the rear corner of the dining hall. Her posture was stiff, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She did not return to her chair. She grabbed David by the arm, her fingernails likely digging into his suit jacket, and jerked him upward. David stumbled, slightly confused. But he did not resist. He never resisted. He followed his wife's silent command, abandoning his halatan dinner. They did not walk toward the head table to offer a parting word. They did not stop at the gift table to leave an envelope. They moved toward the exit doors with the frantic, desperate energy of people fleeing a burning building. I watched them push through the heavy wooden doors and disappear into the night, following the exact same path Alyssa had taken 10 minutes earlier. The biological family I had spent 31 years trying to appease had officially evacuated the premises. They had arrived expecting to witness my surrender, and they were leaving completely defeated, their toxic ecosystem exposed and rejected by an audience of over 100 people. The dining hall seemed to physically expand in their absence. The air felt lighter, the ambient noise of the guests returning to a joyful, unburdened volume. The DJ, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, transitioned the music from the low acoustic playlist to an upbeat driving rhythm that signaled the beginning of the real celebration. The hazard had been neutralized. The boundary had been enforced. But the true test of this new reality was about to begin. The timeline required me to step onto the dance floor, and the man waiting to share that moment with me was the very man who had sparked this entire confrontation. The father-daughter dance was next on the schedule, and it was going to be the final, undeniable proof that the old foundation had been completely demolished. The music pulsed through the floorboards. A tangible vibration that finally shook the last remnants of tension from the room. Caleb's older brother had delivered a speech that was both hilarious and deeply moving. Focusing entirely on the strength of our partnership and ignoring the drama that had preceded it, Clara followed with a toast that brought tears to my eyes. Recounting the long hours we had spent building the binder from the ground up, the reception was operating exactly as it was supposed to. It was a celebration of endurance and chosen love. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching Caleb's nieces and nephews spin in chaotic circles, when I felt a shift in the peripheral energy of the room. I turned my head toward the back exit doors. It was 8:00 inches the evening. The cake cutting was not scheduled for another 30 minutes. The evening was far from over. But my biological family had reached their absolute limit. I watched them gather their belongings from the corner table. The process was entirely devoid of grace or dignity. Helen was practically snatching her silk shawl off the back of the wooden chair, her movements erratic and furious. David was shrugging into his overcoat, his posture still curved inward. A man trying to make himself as small as physically possible. Alyssa was standing slightly apart from them, her dark sunglasses still firmly in place, clutching her purse with white-knuckled tension. They did not approach the head table to offer a parting congratulation. They did not attempt to find me on the dance floor to say a formal goodbye. They did not even walk toward the reception table near the entrance, where a stack of white envelopes and wrapped packages sat waiting. They had come empty-handed, and they were leaving the exact same way. They moved toward the heavy wooden exit doors, with the stealth of people trying to escape unnoticed, slipping out the back like thieves fleeing a scene. I did not stop them. I did not call out their names or attempt to force a confrontation. I simply stood at the edge of the dance floor and watched them go. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the view of the patio and the parking lot beyond. The physical sensation that washed over me in that moment was profound. It was not grief. It was not a sudden wave of loss or the sharp sting of abandonment. It was an intense, nearly overwhelming, unburdening. The air in the cavernous stone mill literally felt lighter. It was as if a low-grade suffocating pressure had been abruptly vented from the room. For 3 decades, I had constantly monitored the emotional barometer of my parents and my sister, adjusting my own behavior to mitigate their sudden drops in pressure. I had spent my entire life bracing for impact. Now the storm system had officially moved out of my territory. I no longer had to track their weather. I walked over to the large, arched window near the sweetheart table and looked out at the gravel parking lot. The exterior lighting cast long shadows across the property. I watched the tail lights of the silver luxury sedan flare bright red as David shifted into reverse. The car swung around its tires, spinning briefly, kicking up a spray of loose gravel. They drove down the long driveway, accelerating faster than necessary, their headlights carving a path through the dark Missouri countryside until they disappeared completely over the crest of the hill. They were gone. The toxic ecosystem I had been born into had finally packed up and relocated. A quiet, a familiar voice spoke from right behind my shoulder. "Taking out the trash on your wedding day." Thomas observed, his tone dry and incredibly calm. I turned around. Thomas was standing there, his navy blue suit still impeccably sharp, holding 2 crystal champagne flutes. He extended one of the glasses toward me. "Good omen," he added, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. I took the glass. I looked at the retired history teacher who had spent his weekends helping me anchor heavy oak shelving into century-old brick walls. I looked at the man who had answered his phone at 6:30 inches the morning and stepped into a void without a single moment of hesitation. I let out a laugh. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a real deep laugh that originated from the very bottom of my chest. It felt incredibly good. The sound was foreign, completely free of the anxiety and careful calculation that had defined so much of my life. It is a very good omen. Thomas, I agreed, clinking my glass against his. We took a sip of the champagne. The crisp, cold liquid felt like a perfect punctuation mark to the evening's events. The conflict with my physical family had officially concluded. The battle lines had been drawn. The boundaries had been tested. And the defensive walls had held firm. The Liu contingency had retreated. Now the evening belonged entirely to the people who actually wanted to be here. The transition was immediate. The DJ raised the volume, the bass thumping against the reclaimed floorboards. Caleb appeared through the crowd. His tie loosened a wide, genuine grin on his face. He snorts, wrapped his arms around my waist, lifting me slightly off the ground, spinning me in a slow circle. The celebration shifted from a defiant stand against toxicity into a pure, unfiltered expression of joy. But there was still one vital piece of the reception schedule left to complete. The traditional events of a wedding are designed to honor the people who shaped you. The father-daughter dance is a symbolic passing of the torch, a moment meant to highlight a bond built on protection and guidance. My biological father had abdicated that role, abandoning his post out of cowardice and misplaced priorities. But the role itself remained, and the man who had truly earned the title was currently standing right next to me holding a champagne flute. The dance floor was calling, and it was time to show the entire room exactly what a real foundation looks like. The departure of the silver sedan acted as a release valve for the entire property. The air inside the stone mill no longer carried the brittle, sharp edge of pending conflict. The guests sensed the shift intuitively. Caleb's relatives claimed the dance floor, with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only exists when no one is keeping score. The waitstaff cleared the remaining dinner plates, replacing them with slices of vanilla bean cake and dark roast coffee. For the first hour after my parents fled, I simply existed inside the celebration. I danced with my new husband. I shared a quiet conversation with my maid of honor by the edge of the patio. I watched the people I loved enjoy the environment I had curated. But the traditional reception schedule still contained one final requirement. A wedding is a sequence of established rituals, and we had reached the moment designated to honor the transition from the family of origin to the family of choice. The DJ lowered the volume of the upbeat rhythm currently playing Sime Sime. He stepped out from behind his mixing board and held the microphone. The bright flashing lights dimmed, replaced by a soft, warm, amber glow that illuminated the center of the room. We are going to slow things down for a moment. The DJ announced his voice, carrying over the low hum of conversation. I would like to invite the bride to the center of the floor for the father-daughter dance. A brief, palpable hush fell over the room. The guests who had witnessed the ceremony knew David Russell had surrendered his chair at the altar. The guest who had been sitting near the back during dinner knew David Russell had already driven away in the dark. There was a split second of collective curiosity regarding how this specific tradition would be handled in his absence. They did not have to wait long for the answer. I stepped onto the reclaimed wood flooring. The crowd naturally parted, forming a wide circle around the center of the room. I looked toward the sweetheart table. Thomas was standing near the edge of the perimeter. He set his empty champagne flute down on a nearby serving tray. He buttoned the center button of his navy suit jacket. He did not look around the room to gauge the reaction of the crowd. He kept his eyes locked firmly on me, and he walked forward. The music started. It was a classic, soulful track driven by a slow bass line and a steady rhythmic horn section. It was a song about enduring hard times and finding solid ground. It matched the cadence of the man walking toward me. Thomas met me in the exact center of the floor. He offered his left hand. I placed my right hand in his palm. He placed his other hand gently on the small of my back. We began to move. The pacing of the narrative seemed to physically slow down, matching the tempo of the horn section, echoing off the limestone walls. This was not a polished, choreographed routine designed for a wedding videographer. Thomas was 68 years old. He had spent 4 decades standing on hard linoleum classroom floors, and his knees were stiff. He moved with a slight, unavoidable limp. On the third measure of the song, his leather shoe caught the heavy silk hem of my wedding dress. He stepped directly on the fabric, causing us both to stumble slightly. "I am sorry, Valerie," he murmured, his face flushing with a brief flash of embarrassment. "I am better with a hammer than I am with a dance floor." I gripped his hand tighter. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "You are doing perfectly, Thomas. Just keep moving." He nodded, adjusting his stance, and we fell back into a steady swaying rhythm. I rested my other hand on his shoulder. I felt the coarse texture of the wool suit. I thought about the stark difference between biological inheritance and structural duty. A shared genetic code is an accident of biology. It requires zero effort. It requires zero sacrifice. My father possessed my DNA, but he used it as an excuse to demand my compliance without ever providing a foundation. He thought the title of father was a birthright that granted him immunity from accountability. The man holding my hand right now shared none of my blood. He had no legal obligation to answer his phone at 6:30 inches the morning. He had no social obligation to subject himself to the furious glare of a Liu matriarch. He chose to be here. He chose to carry the heavy oak shelving up the stairs of my binder 8 years ago. He chose to sit in the front row today. Duty is a conscious daily decision to show up when the heavy lifting is required. The amber lights caught the silver in his hair. We turned slowly, passing the faces of my friends and Caleb's family. I saw Clara smiling through tears. I saw Brenda standing next to Caleb, her hand resting proudly on her son's shoulder as they watched us. The people in this room were not clapping out of polite social obligation. They were not fulfilling a contract. They were offering profound, tearful respect for the bond they were witnessing. They were watching a fractured narrative get rewritten in real time. The song approached its final chorus. The horn section swelled, filling the cavernous space of the mill. Thomas leaned forward slightly. His voice was growly, barely audible over the music meant only for me. "I am proud of the woman you built yourself into, Valerie," he whispered. The words struck the very center of my chest. It was the exact sentence I had spent 3 decades starving to hear. I had chased that specific validation through straight-A report cards, through college honors programs, through every grueling hour I spent restoring ruined books. I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my utility, David Russell would finally look at me and acknowledge my worth. Standing under the string lights, listening to the final notes of the song fade away, the 3-0-year hunger simply evaporated. I realized I did not need to hear those words from the man who shared my last name. I just needed to hear them from a man who actually meant them. Thomas did not view my strength as a threat to a fragile sister. He viewed it as a testament to my character. The track ended. Thomas stepped back. He did not kiss my cheek. He offered the same unyielding nod of respect he had delivered at the altar. I squeezed his hand one last time before letting go. The crowd erupted into applause. It was louder and more resonant than the ovation following the vows. It was a roar of validation. I walked off the dance floor and straight into Caleb's arms. He held me tight, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. The formal obligations of the reception were complete. The rest of the night belonged to the celebration of our new reality. The evening blurred into a sequence of joyful memories. We cut the cake. We danced until the soles of my feet ached. We stood by the rushing creek and watched the stars emerge over the Missouri treeing. When the venue staff finally began turning up the house lights at midnight, Caleb and I drove back to our shared apartment. We were exhausted, triumphant, and entirely free. The first 2 weeks of my marriage were a quiet, protected sanctuary. Caleb returned to the firehouse for his regular shifts, and I reopened the binder. The smell of archival glue and raw leather welcomed me back. The rhythm of my normal life resumed. But the underlying anxiety that had defined my existence was gone. My phone did not ring with frantic demands from my mother. There were no manipulative text messages from Alyssa attempting to rewrite the events of the wedding. The Liu contingency maintained a severe punishing silence. They were administering the silent treatment, assuming the withdrawal of their attention would eventually force me to crawl back and apologize for my defiance. They did not realize I considered their silence a gift. But cowards rarely surrender their narratives permanently. A bully cannot tolerate a story where they are not the victim or the hero. My father had spent the wedding night shrinking into a folding chair, publicly stripped of his patriarchal authority. He had driven away in the dark, fleeing the consequences of his own choices. He was incapable of living with that shame. 3 weeks after the wedding, the mail carrier pushed a stack of envelopes through the brass slot in the front door of my shop. I gathered the letters. Sorting through the standard utility bills and supplier catalogs, near the bottom of the stack was a heavy cream-colored envelope. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, and immediately recognizable. The return address was not the sprawling house in Liu. It was a corporate suite number in downtown St. Louis. My father had bypassed my mother's surveillance and sent a letter directly from his insurance firm. The silence was over, and his desperate attempt to rewrite history was waiting inside the envelope. 3 weeks passed since the silver sedan sped away from the stone mill. My new reality settled into a steady, reliable rhythm. Caleb returned to his rotation at the firehouse. I returned to my workbench. The binder was experiencing its most profitable quarter to date. Word of mouth regarding my restoration work had reached a regional historical society, bringing in lucrative commissions. I was currently engaged in preserving a collection of 19th century correspondence, meticulously cleaning the fragile pages, and reinforcing the deteriorating seams. The physical environment of my shop provided a daily grounding force. The air always carried the distinct scent of aging paper, beeswax, and leather conditioner. Outside the front window, the low hum of Missouri morning traffic created a predictable, comforting soundtrack. I spent my days measuring buckram cloth and tightening the wooden jaws of my laying press. There were no sudden crises. There were no manufactured emergencies demanding my immediate emotional labor. The silence from Liu was a protective barrier I was happy to maintain. But boundaries are rarely respected by the people who have spent their lives benefiting from crossing them. I stood at my counter, staring down at the heavy cream-colored envelope. The mail carrier had just dropped through the brass slot. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was precise, angled, and pressed hard into the paper. David Russell had sent me a letter. I picked it up, noting the thick texture of the expensive corporate stationery. The return address printed in the top left corner was the most telling detail of the entire correspondence. It was the downtown St. Louis address of his insurance firm. He had not mailed this from the house. He had not used the family return labels Helen ordered every Christmas. He was utilizing his corporate sanctuary to initiate contact. This meant Helen had no idea he was writing to me. My father was sneaking around his own wife to manage the fallout of his own cowardice. I did not tear the envelope open with frantic anxiety. I walked back to my workbench. I picked up a polished bone folder. the exact same tool I had been holding 24 days earlier when he called to cancel. His walk down the aisle. I slid the tapered edge of the bone folder under the flap of the envelope and sliced it open with one smooth, clean motion. I unfolded the heavy sheet of paper. The letter was dated 2 days prior. It was written in dark blue ink. I expected a formal apology. I expected a genuine reckoning from a man who had realized the gravity of his failures. What I found instead was a pathetic, calculated attempt to rewrite history and settle an emotional insurance claim out of court. Dear Valerie. The letter began. I am writing this from my office because I need to speak with you directly, without the noise of the current family dynamic. He spent the first paragraph building his defense. He claimed he panicked on the day before the wedding. He wrote that Helen had placed him under immense pressure to keep the peace regarding Alyssa and her fragile state. He painted himself as a victim of circumstance, a man caught between a demanding wife and a grieving oldest daughter. He stated he deeply regretted missing the walk down the aisle and acknowledged that it was a tactical error to stay seated when the doors opened. It was a masterclass in shifting blame. He was willing to admit a minor miscalculation, but he refused to shoulder the actual moral responsibility for abandoning his youngest child. He was trying to minimize his liability. Then the tone of the letter shifted. The faux contrition vanished, replaced by the defensive arrogance of an executive who felt his authority had been unjustly challenged. However, he wrote, "Your decision to replace me with your landlord was deeply humiliating and unnecessary. You orchestrated a public spectacle designed to punish me. You embarrassed your mother and caused irreparable damage to our reputation within the community. You could have walked alone and maintained the dignity of the family. Instead, you chose to flaunt your defiance." It was difficult to read those sentences without laughing at the sheer audacity. He had broken the fundamental contract of our relationship. Yet, he was furious that I had found another man to provide the foundation. He believed I owed him my solitary humiliation to protect his social standing. He expected me to absorb the damage so his pristine public image could remain intact. The final paragraph contained his proposition. It was the ultimate proof of his fundamental weakness. "I want to repair this breach." David wrote, "I know we can find a way to move forward. I would like to take you to lunch next Tuesday at a restaurant near my office. We can smooth things over privately. Just the two of us. Without your mother knowing. Please call my direct office line to confirm." He signed it. Dad. I read the entire letter twice to ensure I had not missed any hidden nuance. There was none. He was asking me to participate in a secret transaction. He wanted the comfort of my forgiveness. But he was too afraid of Helen to seek it in the light of day. He wanted to maintain his compliant marriage in Liu, while managing a covert sanitized relationship with me on his lunch breaks. I set the paper down on the oak workbench. 10 years ago, receiving this level of breadcrumbing from my father would have sent me into a spiral of eager compliance. I would have called his office line immediately grateful for any scrap of his attention, willing to accept the blame for my own wedding, just to secure a private lunch with him. I would have kept his secret. I would have protected his fragile ego. But standing in my binder, now a married woman with a thriving business and a foundation built on solid rock, I felt nothing but clinical disgust. He had not changed. The venue had shifted from the wedding aisle to a corporate lunch table. But the dynamic remained identical. He was still hiding. He was still shifting the blame to the women in his life. He was still entirely incapable of standing up and facing the consequences of his actions. The conflict was no longer about whether my family would show up for me. The conflict was now about what I was going to do with the physical proof of that cowardice. David had handed me a loaded weapon. If I showed this letter to Helen, it would detonate their marriage. It would expose his deception and destroy the united front they projected to the world. He had placed his own survival directly into my hands, trusting that the old version of Valerie, the quiet, compliant youngest daughter, would keep his dirty secret to protect him. He was operating under an outdated blueprint. I looked at the blue ink on the heavy stationery. I looked at the bone folder resting beside it. I had to decide how to answer a man who wanted absolution without accountability. The response required a permanent solution, a final boundary that could never be renegotiated or misunderstood. I read the letter a second time. The words did not change. The proposition remained exactly the same. He was asking me to participate in a covert operation to protect his ego. He wanted to buy my forgiveness for the price of a midweek lunch special in downtown St. Blaise. Louis, he wanted to sit in a leather booth, order a sandwich, and pretend the worst day of my life was just a minor scheduling conflict. 10 years ago, the sheer injustice of this request would have ignited a burning rage inside my chest. I would have drafted a 5-page response, dissecting every single one of his failures. I would have called his office line and demanded an explanation. I would have fought him because fighting implies you still believe the other person is capable of understanding your pain. But standing in the quiet solitude of my shop holding the heavy corporate stationery, I realized the anger was entirely gone. It had burned itself out. Anger requires energy, and I was no longer willing to spend a single drop of my energy on David Russell. What replaced the anger was a cold, clinical, and exhausting pity. I pied a man who had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of wealth and social status, only to realize he was too terrified to defend it. I pied a man who had to sneak around his own wife just to speak to his youngest daughter. He was trapped in a prison of his own, making a prison built with the bricks of his cowardice and mortared with his desperate need for public approval. He was asking me to slip a file through the bars to help him escape. But I was not going to be an accomplice to his dysfunction. I did not need to schedule a secret lunch to deliver my response. I did not need to negotiate the terms of my surrender. I walked over to the tall wooden supply cabinet positioned against the far wall of the binder. The cabinet held my most specialized restoration tools. I opened the top drawer and bypassed the standard graphite pencils and the everyday ballpoint pens. I reached into the back corner and retrieved a specific glass barrel pen filled with crimson archival ink. This was not the kind of ink you use to write a grocery list or sign a temporary contract. It is a highly pigmented acid-free formula. It is explicitly designed by chemists to bind to paper fibers at a molecular level. It is guaranteed to remain legible for hundreds of years without fading, bleeding, or degrading under sunlight. It is the ink I use when I need to reconstruct a missing title page on a 17th century manuscript. I use it when the words need to outlive the person writing them. I brought the red archival pen back to the oak workbench. I did not pull out a fresh piece of paper to draft a formal reply. I was not going to validate his corporate stationery with my own letterhead. I placed his letter flat against the green cutting mat. I uncapped the glass pen. I leaned over the table and pressed the metal nib directly onto the blank space at the very bottom of his page, right beneath his signature. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I did not offer a defense of my choices or a critique of his character. I wrote a single definitive response. I kept my handwriting sharp, steady, and perfectly legible. Some doors close because you shut them. I wrote, letting the crimson ink flow onto the expensive paper. Others closed because I stopped holding them open. I capped the pen and set it down. The red ink dried instantly, fusing with the fibers of the page. The statement was permanent. It was a factual record of our history. He had spent my entire childhood shutting doors in my face to appease Helen and Alyssa. He had shut the door on my college graduation. He had shut the door on walking me down the aisle. I had spent 31 years standing in the hallway, jamming my foot into the door jamb, absorbing the bruises, begging him to let me inside. Now I was simply pulling my foot away and letting the heavy wooden door click shut. The lock was engaging, and I was walking away from the house. I folded his letter in thirds, hiding the text and the red ink inside the creases. I pulled a plain, unbranded brown envelope from my shipping drawer. I slid the folded paper inside and sealed the flap with a damp sponge. I did not write my return address on the corner. He knew where to find me, and I wanted to make it clear that I expected no reply. I wrote his corporate suite number and his name on the front. I peeled a standard postage stamp from a roll and pressed it onto the top right corner. I walked to the front of the shop where a locked metal outbound mail bin sat near the front door. I pulled the lever, placed the brown envelope onto the tray, and let the lever snap back into place. The envelope dropped into the dark metal box with a hollow, satisfying thud. The transaction was over. I was not going to attend a secret lunch. I was not going to keep his secrets. I was returning his cowardice to the exact place it originated. The postal carrier would pick it up at Shtitinula, and David Russell would have to read my boundary. Sitting at his polished mahogany desk, surrounded by the corporate safety he loved more than his own child. I turned my back on the mail bin and looked at the interior of my binder. The morning sunlight was streaming through the large front windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The shop smelled strongly of rich leather, varm beeswax, and the sharp tang of fresh coffee drifting in from the cafe next door. It was a space I had built with my own hands. It was a sanctuary that required no apologies and offered no hidden agendas. A moment later, the brass bell mounted above the front door chimed with a bright, clear ring. I looked toward the entrance. Thomas stepped through the doorframe. He was wearing his usual canvas work jacket, carrying a cardboard tray, holding 2 large cups of coffee. He pushed the door open a few inches wider, with his shoulder holding it steady. A second later, Caleb walked in right behind him. Caleb was on his lunch break from the firehouse, dressed in his dark blue uniform, his radio clipped to his belt. The 2 men had run into each other on the sidewalk outside. They walked into the shop together. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The sterilely anxious memory of my father's letter dissolved the moment they crossed the threshold. Thomas set the cardboard tray down on the counter and handed me a cup. Caleb walked around the workbench, pulled me into a brief, tight hug, and kissed the top of my head. The physical presence of these 2 men was undeniable. They took up space. They brought warmth, laughter, and a loud, grounded reality into my quiet morning. Caleb asked me how the manuscript restoration was going. Thomas pulled his yellow tape measure from his pocket and began examining a loose floorboard near the back wall, muttering something about needing to replace the rusted nails. I stood near the workbench, holding the hot paper cup of coffee, and watched them. I watched the man who gave me a foundation and the man who promised to protect it. They were here because they wanted to be here. There were no ultimatums. There were no calculated power plays. There was just the steady, reliable rhythm of people who show up. The contrast was breathtaking. My biological father was currently sitting in a glass tower drafting secret letters, terrified of his own shadow. The men in my shop were inspecting floorboards and asking about my day, entirely unbothered by the weight of the world. I took a sip of the dark coffee and let the realization settle deep into my bones. The family hierarchy I had been conditioned to worship was nothing but a fragile illusion. The real hierarchy was based entirely on action. You spend your childhood believing that the people who share your blood hold a sacred, unbreakable claim on your future. You are taught that biology is a debt you have to repay, with endless loyalty even when the creditors are bankrupting your soul. Society tells you to honor your parents, to keep the peace, to absorb the damage, because family is everything. But blood only dictates where your story begins. It does not write the ending. If your biological family requires you to shrink so they can feel tall, they are not your family. They are just your relatives. If they demand your presence but refuse to offer their protection, you owe them nothing. You are allowed to walk away from a table where the only thing being served is resentment. You are allowed to stop holding the door open for people who only want to stand in the doorway and criticize the house. I looked at Caleb, who was laughing at a joke Thomas had just made. I smiled, feeling the solid oak floorboards beneath my feet. You cannot choose the family you are born into. You cannot control the circumstances of your arrival or the limitations of the people who raised you. But you have absolute power over who gets to walk you into your future. Choose the people who stand up when the doors open. Choose the people who build things that last. It has been 2 years since that October afternoon at the stone mill. The letter I dropped into the outbound mail bin was the last direct contact I had with David Russell. He never replied to the red archival ink. Helen never staged another ambush. Alyssa finalized her divorce and moved into a condo downtown, still chasing an audience that shrinks a little more every year. I do not track their lives anymore. My binder expanded. We hired an assistant last spring. Caleb and I bought a small historic house with good bones, and Thomas comes over every other Sunday to drink black coffee on our front porch. When you spend 3 decades surviving inside a toxic ecosystem, stepping out into the fresh air feels shocking to the lungs. You expect the other shoe to drop. You expect the peace to be a trick. But it isn't. The peace is just what happens when you finally stop fighting people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Looking back at the wreckage and the rebuilding, I walked away with 5 distinct truths, 5 lessons I carved out of that experience, which I now treat as the absolute foundation of my life. First, family is an action, not an accident of biology. DNA is just a genetic starting line. Real family is defined by the people who show up, who carry the heavy wood up the stairs, and who stand beside you when the heavy double doors open. Second, a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of preservation. For years, I thought setting a boundary meant I was being cruel. I learned that saying no to their manipulation was simply saying yes to my own survival. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else's golden child warm. Third, you cannot outlove a coward. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn my father's protection through achievement and quiet compliance. But a man who values his own comfort over his daughter's dignity will never step up, no matter how perfect you try to be. You have to stop holding the door open for people who refuse to walk through it. Fourth, your milestones belong to you. Your wedding, your graduation, your promotion. They are not dumping grounds for your family's unresolved trauma or social posturing. Reclaiming those moments is not selfish. It is your right. Fifth piece is expensive, but it is always worth the price. Gaining my freedom cost me the illusion of a traditional family. It cost me parents and a sister. But what I bought with that currency was a quiet mind, a strong marriage, and a life that actually belongs to me. I still fix broken things for a living. I still stitch torn pages and restore ruined spines, but I no longer try to fix people who prefer to stay broken. I leave them exactly where they are, and I keep building. If you have ever had to walk away from the table you were born at to build your own, you are not alone. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story helped you find your own clarity, or if you simply understand what it means to choose your own family, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let me know which of those 5 lessons hit closest to home for you. I read every single one. Stay strong. Protect your peace. And keep listening to Revenge Stories.